introduce to you our pastor, Dr. George Mason, who will come and share with us first.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with you this morning. Thank you for the hospitality of this great church and your wonderful pastor. Reverend Haynes, I underdressed now having seen you, but I expected you to be in one of your famous t-shirts. So then I figured I'd be overdressed, but anyway. Thank you for your friendship and for your collegiality in the gospel and for all this work we get to do together. We're proud of your church, so proud of you and your church, and we're grateful to be partners with you. Commissioner Price, thank you for showing up this morning and being with us, and it's a pleasure to interact with you in the community as well, and appreciate your leadership. We have a number of people from our church here also, and I think they're probably a bit obvious to you. So here we are. We're going to talk today. This is the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's death, and it is a time when we are taking stock, aren't we? Taking stock in the question of where stands the dream, right? That dream that was so beautifully articulated in 1963 has continued to be important to the American experience, has been something that has animated the hearts and minds of so many for this half century, but also something that has been easily co-opted by people who have sought to sanitize it and use it for their own purposes. I think it is challenging for me to be first up today to speak about Dr. King's dream when white people have been pretty committed to co-opting that dream when we haven't even opted it. Wow. You got to opt something first, you know. What that is to say, it's up to us to opt in to this dream. If his dream is going to be successful in our time, it is because we will be in this together. That it will matter to us in a way that convinces you that it matters to us. I can't tell you that it will ever naturally matter to us as much as it matters to you. Again, these are things that I'm learning not to pretend. Okay? So some of what I'm going to say today, I will say more to people who look like me in this group. And others of you are going to have to overhear it. For obvious reasons, I hope. I hope that will be helpful. But as we think about advocacy and where we go forward, it's at least important for you to understand, some of you, what we are thinking, how we are seeking to be partners in this effort. Like too many white people and pastors, I have been too slow in coming along, but I will tell you that God has been at work in my life. And the fact that you have invited me here is partly because of the relationship of trust that is building, and I'm so grateful for that. So in preparation, I once again read Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail. 4 months before his speech, I Have Dreams speech, he wrote many of the same things from that narrow cell to white moderates. That would be people like me. Okay. Pastors who had criticized his work in Birmingham for being untimely, for being too provocative. These were the kinds of things that were taking place, and in a sense, what was happening is Dr. King was coming to understand that the biggest problem they faced at that time was not the obvious racism of the KKK and others, but it was the well-meaning white moderates who had and who have, even today, a commitment to social justice in theory, but who find a problem with every particular action that makes it difficult for us to make progress. So some of what I'm going to say to you today is simply, I guess, my own personal musings of things I have learned on the way to a commitment that I not be a white moderate problem pastor. If I can at least do that much, then maybe we'll be on our way to some partnership. So these are some of the things I am learning. First of all, listen to another person's pain and don't tell them what they ought not feel or how they ought to do something different just because you wish it were otherwise. So this can all be boiled down to some of you women in the group here this morning understand the term mansplaining. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Like when I try to tell my wife how she ought to do something around the house. You know? Yeah. So one of the temptations that some of us have is to address matters of racial justice in a way that really amounts to white-splaining. That is to say, we know what's going on here. You don't have a clear understanding of things, so let us enlighten you. This is a product of simply being in a default position of power and assuming, therefore, you have clarity of vision. And so learning that about yourself is an important thing so that you have a kind of humility about engaging in this way. Right. Which involves then learning to acknowledge that you have white privilege. Don't deny that it's so. What does it help to deny that you have privilege? That we have worked to achieve certain things is not something we have to defend. That we have started farther along the way is something we have to acknowledge. That there are deep inequalities in our society. And for us to pretend that everyone starts at the same place is absolutely false. So it's not helpful to making progress. Acknowledge white privilege because it is what it is. Next, don't pick your favorite black leaders who make you comfortable. Now this is what happens in our community. Did you know? All right. So in the ministry we do this, right, Freddie? Okay. So we like that black minister because he sort of preaches and has that way of understanding the gospel in the church that's similar to ours. So we want to cooperate with and advocate with this one, but this one makes us uncomfortable. So, but this gets back to white people thinking that they can choose who the good blacks are. Well, it is. You know. So again, it's about listening and paying attention. The question is what we can learn, not what we can teach. This is not about attitudes as much as it is about systems and structures of our society.
Yeah, right. That's it.
I mean, we've had a week, haven't we? Dear God, we've had a week.
Right.
We've had a year. And let's be honest, all this has done is uncover what most of you have always been telling us is true all the time. And we've been saying, you know, but we've made progress. You know, it's not like it used to be. By the way, when white people talk about progress, that is often that's often masking a desire to slow down. You know, because what we want is credit. You know, not more change. And so what I'm fine with is if you talk about progress, I'm happy to hear that. But if I talk about progress, you should be suspicious of that. Well, right. All right, but look, it's very difficult to get into the heart and mind of people. But we should, if somebody, you know, what is it Maya Angelou said? You know, if somebody tells you something, you ought to believe them. You know, and so if people use their words and say what they say, then you ought to believe that that's what they feel and believe. Look, we don't want to use language about racism that closes off the possibility of redemption, that makes it impossible for us to make progress or to have real relationship with people. But the idea that if we could change our attitudes, everything would be fine. If we changed our hearts, everything would change. Well, it doesn't seem to work that way. Sometimes what has to change are our laws, our policies, so that we will learn to live into a new life arrangement together and get used to that. And so that's something that is too new to white advocates. You know, we want to work on changing people's hearts, but it's necessary for us to engage in a more systematic understanding of how evil is resident in the way we organize life together. Until we have systems of justice and equity in our society where people can flourish by their own hard work, by their cooperation with one another, changing our attitudes and being people of goodwill is not going to be enough. Show up and speak up for those who are denied justice. One of the things I've learned is that it's really not enough to hold an opinion at a distance. It's necessary to be there when the tension is thick and when the conflict is real.
Right.
And just being there is a spiritually, theologically, incarnational understanding of how change happens. That is, your presence matters. So when you just show up, the friendship and the confidence that is built that we want this dream to be realized, that's enhanced just by being there. And I'll give you some I'll just give you one illustration of that, and that is, you know, when Ebola came to town a couple of years ago, Commissioner Price and I ended up quite often with a woman who was a member of our church, Louise Troe, and she and her son and 2 nephews were quarantined for 3 weeks in a remote location, and we got to visit. Other people didn't get to do that. But you remember how polarizing this was in the community. What I learned was that, okay, first of all, let's be honest about, it was an odd thing, right, that Louise Troe was a member of our church, right? She didn't look a lot like us, right? And that's a whole other story, but it is what it is. And so this could have been a deeply racially divisive thing for our city. And there were people trying to make it so, let's be honest. But your pastor here helped me because of our relationship. And some of that has to do with his inviting me to show up at the Justice for Trayvon rally. And because we were there together, a bond was built, and he was able to say to people, it's okay. George can do this. His church can do this. And we don't have to worry about this being racialized in this way because we can trust one another. But you have to have those relationships before crisis happens in order for there to be this extension of trust so that the best possible result can take place. So sometimes you don't even know what you're doing for the long term by being there in the meantime, in the moment. But that's why it's important to develop these relationships. It's why it's important for you to be here today. White people need to learn that it's not always our job to lead. The aggrieved should be given voice. It is for us to use our power, but not in order to do for, but to do with. You know, the truth is that for whatever reason, we sometimes, white people, have access to, through relationships, to political figures and to people in boardrooms and courtrooms and all of that, where we can pick up the phone, you know, and they'll answer. Where we have access to people, and we can sometimes get our own concerns handled rather quickly just because of relational capital. Everyone doesn't have that, you know. And so we sometimes think that if we could just handle things quickly and easily behind the scenes, then they will be handled. But all that does is it reinforces the privilege. Instead of using our access for and on behalf of people who don't have it. So it's important for us to acknowledge that we have some power, but how we use that power is critically important, so that it doesn't end up being about us again and again and again. Patience is the privilege of the powerful. Things will change when the moral conscience of those who are not directly affected becomes as bothered by injustice as those who are affected.
Right, yeah, right.
Now, that's just about King from the Birmingham jail.
Right.
Begin with the end in mind. When you're involved in advocacy and working together, the question is, what do we really want? And one of the beautiful phrases about this imagination of what is to be is the notion of the beloved community. Right? Christianity is about the future. It's not about where we came from. It's not about preserving or returning to an ideal past. It is from the beginning. The Genesis story is not just a story of origins. It's a story of destiny.
Come on.
It's an imagination of God's dream for the world. Okay? And so we have not so much fallen from something that we have to go back to. We have simply not yet achieved what God has put in our hearts and minds to imagine. Work. See? So our faith, therefore, is not about conserving and holding and preserving and always going back as if we, well, it's pretty obvious where I'm going here. Make the church great again. Make America great again. Right? It's sort of like, revival. You got to be vived once before you can be revived. But what we're looking for is our imagination of a world in which people can flourish whoever they are. Amen. Where there is a peaceable kingdom at long last. When this imagination of our life together is, we can breathe. We can look at each other and see each other as sisters and brothers. And that's crucially important. But let me say to white folks in the room, that's not about being colorblind. So maybe it's about being color-mind. That is to say, God made this world in all its beautiful diversity. And what our goal should be is to embrace and enjoy and experience that diversity as gifts of God. The notion of colorblindness, in a way that King would speak of it, has more to do with the desire that we would be, of course, judged by our character and not the color of our skin. It's a difference between judging by color and discriminating about color. Okay? So what we want to do is we need to be more aware of color because of the experiences that are different for people. And in doing so, by becoming more of a racially conscious society, we will not be as racially unjust a society. So the point for us as white people is to learn to understand and respect color and its differences without letting it define people in terms of value. Okay? So our experience is more deeply enriched by recognizing those differences. But we don't want them, we don't want color, what color blindness is for most white people is a sense of white being the default color. Okay? And it's important for us to learn that. That when we say those things, usually that really is, again, a kind of masking of our desire for others to operate on our terms, instead of recognizing the beauty of all of us together. Amen. Then, I believe it's important for us to learn as white allies that the goal is racial justice. It is not racial reconciliation.
Say that. Say that. Say that.
See, racial reconciliation suggests that there was a time when there was conciliatory relationships. I mean, there was a time when everything was fine. You know. Once you go there in the American experience, what that actually means is we're back in the fields and in the plantations, and we're back in a time when we were able to say that if we could just go back there, things would be good. But things have never been like they should be in America. And so the goal is not to reconcile. The goal is simply to get to that place where we understand that we are equally involved together in this community, in this country, and where we care about equal opportunity, where we care about, and where we care even about the possibility of tremendous outcomes, not just opportunity. This is another thing that white people talk about. Well, you know, we don't want to guarantee outcomes because that undermines people's work ethic. Well, I'd like to see some different outcomes, would you? Yeah. You know, and so why is it not possible for us to invest in systems and approaches that will create outcomes where people can flourish who have not? It seems to me that's only fair and just, given 2 centuries of our favoring our own success in that way. So reconciliation, I think, is a language that's beautiful in spiritual terms and in personal relationships, but in terms of justice work, we should seek more than that. Right. We need to understand there is always a cost to being involved. But when we do, we should also understand, especially those of us who are advocates in the white community, that whatever pain we endure will never be the same, will never be equal to the pain that people have endured whom we are advocating for. So we don't make it about us. And if it's difficult, there was a Lord who invited us to take up our cross and follow him. And who said that the servant is not greater than the master, that we should not expect that we would have it easier just because he did it for us. He did it for us that we might enter into and participate with him in his suffering, so that we might all experience the great gladness and joy of his resurrection power. You don't get to the resurrection unless you go through the cross. And so therefore, it is necessary for us to learn how to willingly accept what sacrifices are called for in order for us to share in the joy of the kingdom that is coming. I've learned a lot about this in the last few years, some of it from relationships with you, and I'm simply grateful. The Apostle Paul had everything in the way of privilege. In Philippians chapter 2, he talked about, or 3, he talked about his privilege, about how he was a Pharisee of the Pharisees, you know. he could have had a very easy career, a reputation and a legacy within his community. But he had a real encounter with the Lord.
Yeah.
You know. And what that meant was that it would change him. And he said about that then, that he counted it all as, I need the president to give me a word here. He counted it all as dung for the sake of following Jesus. All of his privilege. Whatever gains I had, these I have come to regard as loss because of Christ, he said.
Right.
Now that is what we're talking about. That is what it means for us to be engaged in spiritual leadership that is transformative. What he knew was that if he only served his Jewish community, he would always be blessed by that community. But the Gentiles needed the gospel. Those who were previously outsiders needed to be part of the beloved community. And it was a costly decision for him, but it also brought him surpassing joy. Those are the kinds of things that I'm learning, that some of our folk in our church are learning, and it's what gives me real hope going forward in our partnership together. I thank you for teaching us, for encouraging us, and for praying for us. Keep at it.